117.3 million people, or 1 in 69 individuals worldwide, are forcibly displaced. This data of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, tracks the number of refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced, and stateless people around the world. Of the forcibly displaced 117.3 million people, 68.3 million are displaced within their own countries due to conflict or other crises. Like Gaza, where the UN estimates Israel's continuing assault has displaced about 75% population, or over 1.7 million people. The number of refugees who crossed international borders in 2023 rose by 7% to 43.4 million. The surge is driven by displacement in Sudan and ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and other regions. The number of asylum seekers, or the people seeking protection in another country due to persecution or fear of harm in their home country, stood at 6.9 million, an increase of 26% from the previous year.
Hundreds and hundreds every day are crossing from one devastated country to one of the poorest countries in the world. In the last few months, a steep rise in the arrival of Sudanese refugees from the war areas or from the neighboring countries into North Africa, Libya, Tunisia in particular, and then across to Italy. So there's no point in screaming and anguishing about these flows when very little or not enough is done to stop the reasons why they're coming.
Under international law, refugees are people who are forced to flee their home countries to escape persecution or serious threats to their life or freedom. Each year, 20th June is designated by the United Nations as World Refugee Day, to raise awareness about the dire situation of the refugees worldwide. In this episode of WION Wideangle, we look at the global refugee crisis plaguing the world, the reasons for the refugees leaving their home countries, and the top 5 refugee-receiving countries. Millions are on the move all year long. Fleeing conflict, persecution, and poverty, the world is seeing more refugees today than it has in decades.
Right now in the world, you're seeing a huge surge in refugees, whether it be in Afghanistan, from Syria, from a lot of Middle Eastern countries and a lot of African countries, Sudan, Nigeria, Yemen, even Pakistan and China now are seeing a huge number of refugees these days. But we're really seeing a growth in the number of people who are definitionally refugees in the world. And we're seeing this become a much, much bigger problem than it was even a few years ago.
For European countries receiving new arrivals, the difference between a migrant and a refugee marks a crucial distinction. Refugees are people who have fled war, violence, conflict, or persecution and have crossed an international border to find refuge in another country. Leaving behind homes, possessions, jobs, and loved ones. They often flee with little more than just the clothes on their back. In 1951, the UN established the Refugee Convention to protect the rights of refugees in Europe. In the aftermath of World War II, in 1967, the convention was expanded to address displacement across the world. In 1951, Refugee Convention entitles refugees to basic rights under international law, including the right to not be immediately deported and sent back. A migrant, however, is someone who chooses to resettle in another country in search of a better life. Not all migrants are refugees, but refugees can all fall under the migrant umbrella. Refugees have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, or political opinion. Most likely, they cannot return home or are afraid to do so. War and ethnic, tribal, and religious violence are the leading causes of refugees fleeing their countries. When the Refugee Convention was born, the world had 2.1 million refugees. By 1980, the UN recorded 10 million refugees for the first time. Wars in Afghanistan and Ethiopia during the 1980s caused the number of refugees to double to 20 million by 1990. The number of refugees was fairly consistent over the next 2 decades. And then the numbers started surging. Due to one crisis after another. Let's take a look at the countries where the refugees come from. Almost 3/4, that's 72% of all refugees, come from just 5 countries and regions. Afghanistan, Syria, Venezuela, Ukraine, and Palestine. In Gaza, Israel's bombardment and the devastating ground campaign have taken a massive toll on the Palestinian civilian population. $1.7 million people, nearly 80% of Gazans, are internally displaced. Many of them multiple times. Displacement is all too familiar to Palestinians. Many fled their homes in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War in a forced migration known in Arabic as the Nakba, or catastrophe. After Israel was established, many sought temporary shelter in the Jordan-controlled West Bank and the Egypt-controlled Gaza Strip. The United Nations Relief Agency for Palestinians, or UNRWA, has 6 million Palestinian refugees currently under its mandate. UNRWA has 1.6 million Palestine refugees registered in Gaza. For many displaced Palestinians like Ahmed al-Shinbari, it's a daily struggle to source clean drinking water. He treks over an hour away from their makeshift shelter in Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp to find water.
After the invasion of Jabalia, they washed out all the water wells. In the beginning, little water remained after the first invasions and shelling, but now that Jabalia was all bulldozed, there is not even a single water well left. Even the infrastructure from which we used to get water no longer exists. Water is a big tragedy in Jabalia camp. I swear to God, I hope the war stops and we return to our homes, even if it's in tents. It is enough after 8 months and we are still in areas with no life, no water, no food, no drinking, no electricity, no windows or doors, and burnt schools.
Around central Gaza's Nusayrat camp, 17-year-old Sujud al-Harazin keeps walking up and down the shore. She has come up with an idea to sell tea and coffee to support her family financially. The Israeli army arrested Sujud's brother, Abdullah, at the Netzarim checkpoint, while her father stayed in the north to continue his duties as a paramedic.
I had to undertake this project to provide an income for my family and support them so they wouldn't have to ask for money from others. I came up with the idea of selling coffee, tea. My hope is to be reunited with my father and to see my brother released from prison. I long to return to my normal life, to my studies and my room.
Gaza is in the grip of a humanitarian crisis due to widespread hunger, scarcity of essentials, and continuing displacement of civilians. With nearly 2.4 million registered Palestinian refugees, close to half of the total of all Palestinian refugees, Jordan is home to the largest number. More than 2 million registered Palestinian refugees live in Jordan. Many of them have full citizenship. Followed by Syria, where about 584,000 Palestinian refugees live. And Lebanon, with about 491,000 Palestinian refugees, according to the UN agency's 2023 estimates. The full-scale war in Ukraine that started in February 2022 after Russia's invasion of the country led to one of the fastest growing refugee crises in Europe since World War II. About 2 years since the conflict erupted, 10 million Ukrainians still cannot return home. Almost 4 million remain internally displaced within Ukraine, and over 6 million refugees have found shelter abroad, not only in Europe, but also overseas.
We believed till the last moment that everything would be all right. We did not take things out. My husband said to stay in Kyiv and that in 2 or 3 months, everything would be fine. We believed it. We did not expect that our city would be destroyed so drastically.
We have families and single people who have managed to cross the border or who are stuck in Berlin and can no longer go home. It's a very distressing situation for people. They haven't shown tears, but their bewilderment at what is happening in their homeland is almost palpable.
Over 1.2 million refugees from Ukraine were recorded in Russia as of June 30th, 2023. 956,635 refugees reached Poland after fleeing Ukraine till December 15, 2023. And around 6 million Ukrainian refugees are registered across Europe, and 6.5 million worldwide till February 2024. Most of them fled Ukraine by crossing the border into Poland. As of February 2024, Germany had over 1.1 million refugees from Ukraine. And compared to other European countries, Germany had the highest monthly financial allowance for Ukrainians who fled the war.
Well, I think we've seen with the situation in Ukraine, more than 3 million people displaced as a result of the conflict since early 2022, so in just over 2 years, and certainly countries across the world have received Ukrainians, but particularly across much of Eastern, Central and Western Europe.
In 2023, violent clashes erupted between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support forces in Sudan. Millions were displaced, including internally displaced people, asylum seekers, and refugees. The country had already been grappling with violence and displacement since the onset of the Darfur crisis in 2003. The strife-torn country was home to 1.1 million refugees before violence erupted last April. Most of the refugees were from South Sudan and northern Ethiopia, with many escaping ethnic violence in Tigray. Post-clashes between the SAF and RFS, the humanitarian situation has rapidly deteriorated. Earlier this month, the International Organization for Migration warned the number of people displaced by the Sudan conflict could exceed 10 million. As of April 2024, over 8.6 million people are displaced. This includes more than 6.5 million people displaced within Sudan, and over 2 million people who fled to neighboring countries. Chad has received the largest number of people, 571,815, followed by Egypt with 500,000 Sudanese refugees, South Sudan 135,085, Ethiopia 33,389, and Central African Republic had 23,286 Sudanese refugees.
Predominantly find themselves in Europe, which is responding by pushing them back out. Ironically, because Europe is cracking down on refugees from Sudan and Africa, we're seeing a huge influx of people ending up at the U.S. border who are of African descent. And so really, you close one border and people end up finding a different place where they end up being, right?
Before the war, Sudan hosted many Syrian refugees. When the war started, the number of Syrian refugees in Sudan dropped from 93,500 in 2022 to 26,600 in 2023. As many left for other countries. Thousands of people are still being displaced daily, more than a year after the conflict began.
Each one of them asked the same thing that could be summarized in 3 words: water, food, and dignity. I could see myself that we do our best as MSF to supply water, and you understand that this is not the key area of expertise for a medical organization. But I was really surprised and saddened to see that in many of these places we are maybe even the only actor, or we supply the 70 or 80% of the water.
Since the start of the Syrian civil war in 2011, more than 14 million Syrians have been forced to flee their homes in search of safety. In its 13th year now, it is described as one of the largest refugee crises in history. Approximately 5.5 million Syrian refugees live in 5 countries neighboring Syria: Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. Germany is the largest non-neighboring host country with over 850,000 Syrian refugees. However, the current state of refugees living in Lebanon is deplorable. Syrian refugees are constantly in fear of deportation as the Lebanese security forces crack down on them.
I am deeply distressed and unable to sleep after hearing that they will deport us. We have no place to live there, and obtaining food is not possible. Our land has become barren and devoid of everything.
Afghanistan has seen more than 4 decades of conflict and instability. And in August 2021, with the Taliban's takeover of Kabul, the instability only intensified in Afghanistan. Today, more than 8 million Afghans are out of their homes because of conflict, violence, and poverty. At least 3.2 million Afghans are displaced within the country, and a vast majority of Afghan refugees are living in Pakistan and Iran. The situation for the Afghan refugees isn't any better in Pakistan. In October last year, Pakistan threw the lives of hundreds of thousands of Afghan refugees in jeopardy by ordering all undocumented Afghan migrants to leave its soil. Hundreds of thousands of Afghans packed up their belongings to start afresh in their homeland, a place they hadn't seen in months. John Muhammad was one of them. 7 months after fleeing Pakistan out of fear of deportation, John Muhammad and many others are still living in dire conditions in Afghanistan, with no hope of a better future.
We are spending Eid as if we were in prison. We are still grateful to Allah that we are alive, but sometimes we regret that as well. We can't do anything. This year and this Eid, we have become fully bankrupt. Since we have returned to Afghanistan, we have become like wanderers. We have lost our way out of distress.
Adding yet another displacement crisis in the world, the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela has become one of the largest international displacement crises in the world, with 7.7 million Venezuelans displaced globally. The majority of displaced Venezuelans, 6.5 million, are currently living in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thousands of Venezuelans cross various South American countries on foot. Many flee without knowing their final destination. They leave behind their families and their loved ones.
We left my country, Venezuela, sometime in December. I've been on this journey for nearly 6 months. It hasn't been easy. I left my country because of the economy. There's no food, there's no medicine.
My friend and I, like many others, have been waiting here for 3 days for a chance to cross the border. I have seen people crossing in small groups of 3 to 5, but there is always the danger of cutting themselves on the wire fence. Everyone does whatever it takes to get across to the US.
Everyone does whatever it takes to get across the border. That line of Pedro Flores sums up the desperation of a refugee or a migrant as they continue to embark on clandestine journeys, fleeing violence and poverty in their home countries. The need for a global consensus on migration is becoming even more critical. After all, no one should ever have to battle to find a safe place to call home.